Careful with that stuff,
a voice rang out, and Tia's head shot around to glare at the man standing by the door. The little box in her hand was shaking, as her breath formed clouds in the normally humid air of the room.
How about you shut your mouth? Otherwise this house will have another occupant soon.
She growled back, and watched the guy lift his hands to calm her down. She knew what she was doing, as did he. The only problem was that Bob seemed far too relaxed for the kind of work they had been paid for.
Just saying,
he replied with a smirk on his lips, and Tia had to bite the inside of her cheeks to keep herself from tearing the guy a new one. She could feel it already, those cold and hot tendrils coming from the box. Invisible to the eye, yet dangerous nonetheless. This thing was waking up already, too early. It would be better to seal it again, but that time was running out. If they weren't careful, they'd miss the deadline and give the company that had hired them a reason to stiff them.
How about you get the next one already and leave me alone?
Her voice sounded strangely hollow in her own ears, while the box in her hands was still trembling. She could see the hole in the floor in front of her, but her vision seemed to get more and more blurry the longer she concentrated on it.
Can't do that. You know the rules,
he replied, and Tia felt like his voice was coming from farther away for some reason. The cold air around her seemed to warm up, and this strangely welcoming feeling was spreading throughout her chest. She blinked, and in her hazy vision, the hole in the floor looked like it was growing and taking on a new form. It swallowed the box in her hands, then her arms, and Tia felt soothing fingers touching her cheeks, stroking them gently while her body slowly moved and shifted. Everything was all right, she thought. There was no reason to get angry or shout. All she needed to do was give over control. A shock made her stumble, and pain filled her body as electricity coursed through her cells, making all her muscles cramp up at once. Tia screamed as she hit the floor, then groaned and blinked away the curtain of tears that seemed to have fallen over her vision. Her colleague was above her, holding the box now and showing her this dumb grin of his.
Told you so.
He chuckled, then put the taser back into the holster of his belt as he carefully placed the box in the hole, opened the clasp, and quickly shut the hidden hatch back up. Tia groaned again and allowed herself to relax for a single moment.
Shit,
she whispered as she closed her eyes. Slowly, the tingling feeling in her fingers subsided, and then a hand grabbed her by the shoulder and helped her up.
I was getting worried,
she heard him say as he pulled her to her feet.
That's the first time you were possessed in a year. I almost thought you were immune to shit like that.
She could hear how much he had enjoyed tasing her, and some part of her hated Bob for that. Then again, he had saved her.
I owe you one,
Tia replied, and felt a sharp pain as she pulled out one of the barbs of the taser. He gave the hidden hatch a slight pat, then turned and smiled at her as she ripped out the second barb.
We ain't gonna start keeping score, right? Otherwise, I'd owe you quite a few already. Let's just go out, get the next ones, and I need to put a new cartridge in my taser.
The after effects still lingered, but she nodded. Her whole body felt strange. Getting possessed by those things was almost inevitable, no matter how careful one was. And here, in this house, it was even worse. Officially, the contract stated that they had to set up 23 boxes in different rooms, all hidden in secret compartments, and all of them opened and raring to go. This place would soon turn into a death trap, Tia thought, and felt a shiver running through her. She didn't even want to know how much money was flowing from the owner of this house to her employer. This was insane. 23 different spirits in one place. Tia straightened up and looked over at Bob, who was still waiting by her side. She was glad he was here, after all. Those boxes with their cursed objects inside were far too dangerous to handle, especially with the atmosphere changing so rapidly. They had started in the attic last night and had now finally finished with the upper floor. Now, they needed to go down to the ground floor and continue their work there. She sighed.
I don't want to see this place once they've woken up,
she heard him say, and nodded in response. Yeah, those boxes had been made for that purpose. They weren't meant to contain those spirits for a long time. It would start to crumble and disappear after about a day. This whole building was pretty much a supernatural time bomb. Tia grabbed hold of Bob's shoulder to steady herself for another moment, then gave him a nod, and the two of them started walking out of the room. She could hear the noise of footsteps coming from above, followed by this scratching sound that was meant to draw people's attention. The one in the attic was already waking up, she thought with a shiver, and quickened her steps. Bob seemed to notice it as well. She could see him looking up with a strange expression on his face. It was time to get out of this floor. He walked into the hallway that would lead them to the stairs going down. The building itself was beautiful, she thought. A villa almost a century old, but only recently restored to its former glory. There was no plaster here, no paper-thin walls or gaudy decorations. Whoever had built it had meant for it to withstand the ravages of time, which was probably why the owner had chosen the place for this experiment or whatever it was. Not that the spirits would do anything to destroy their own home, but with that many in one place, things were bound to get strange. Tia felt a hand on her shoulder and stopped for a moment. The hallway they were passing through was distorting slightly. She could see it and felt it as well. It was extending just for another second before it shrunk back again.
Fucking hell,
the man next to her whispered.
I think it's starting already. We need to hurry up.
Tia nodded and began jogging while her colleague kept pace with her. The sounds coming from the attic were growing louder as well, but now she could also hear groans from other rooms on the floor. They were breaking down the boxes quicker than she had anticipated. Were they resonating with each other, strengthening their curses? She had a bad feeling about it, but thankfully already reached the head of the stairs. where a single red line was drawn. The owner had put in a precaution, she noticed, jumped over the line, and could immediately hear the noises stopping completely. Bob followed close behind, and Tia saw him turning around and taking a deep breath once he found himself on the stairs as well.
I don't think I'm allowed to ask about its purpose, right?
He wanted to know, and Tia gave him a playful shove. Of course he wasn't. They were not getting paid to ask questions, but to set up the boxes. Whatever the owner wanted to do with this place wasn't any of their concern. That didn't mean that Tia wasn't freaked out by it, though. It felt like a death trap, if she was honest. Like some twisted experiment, almost. The upper floor and attic were shielded from the ground floor, which meant that once the boxes down there had been set up, there would be a hard border between the spirits. If someone walked up the stairs once all the things were put in place and awake, it would feel like the whole house was twisting around, right? She shivered at the thought, then grabbed hold of Bob's shoulder and pulled him along as they descended the stairs. 7 boxes on the first floor, 3 more in the basement. She felt a cold chill as she thought about it. Tia and her colleague finally reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at the wide-open space of the main hall. The hiding spot for its box was in the wall to her right, but stood, as of yet, empty. They would put this one in last. Otherwise, the spirit inside that box might make their lives difficult. Tia could hear her shoes on the marble floor as she walked across the room and looked at the big piano standing in the corner. What an obvious prop, she thought, and felt another chill. There were enough apparitions that loved making sounds to draw in their victims, and such an instrument was pretty much an invitation for them. The owner had to be completely crazy. There was no way anyone would survive here without getting either possessed or torn apart by the spirits. Then, what was the plan? Bob sped up a bit again, reached the anteroom and opened the front door. The sunshine outside seemed to avoid even the stone steps leading to the entrance. Tia could feel herself following him quickly. It was almost like her own body was eager to leave this place behind, even though she knew very well that they would return in just a few minutes. The moment she stepped out of the house and felt a cool breeze blowing past her, Tia could finally breathe normally again. The atmosphere in there had been strange, she realized. Suffocating and threatening. She glanced back and could see the red line behind the front entrance. Another barrier, she thought, then forced herself to look up ahead as she jumped down the 3 steps and landed on the gravel path where that truck stood.
Only 10 to go,
she heard Bob say with a slight smile and nodded. Yeah, they had a job to do. There was no point in worrying right now. The longer they dawdled, the worse it might get. Especially now that they needed to take care of the other 2 floors. Ground floor and basement. Tia couldn't hide a shiver as she thought about it and was glad that Bob wasn't looking at her for now. He was up ahead, walking briskly toward the van they had parked at the end of the gravelled path.
You want to start with the basement, right?
He asked, without turning around, and Tia agreed. Yeah, doing the ground floor first would mean they would have to walk through a room with an active spirit to get down there. and that was something she really wanted to avoid. Tia heard Bob opening the back of the van and felt an immediate cold chill coming from inside the vehicle. 10 boxes were neatly arranged with labels and charms on them. 3 for the basement, 7 for the ground floor. They still had a long way to go. She watched as Bob's hand flew over the 3. Basement main, basement side, basement corridor. The first one, the biggest, was darker than the other 2.
Give that one to me. You can take the one for the side room,
she said. Bob looked back and nodded before grabbing and passing along the biggest one. Tia took it and felt a sudden tremor running through the wood.
This one is bad,
a voice inside her head warned. Yeah, something was definitely up with that box. It felt colder than it should and was already vibrating, as if the spirit inside was in the process of waking up.
I think we need to hurry,
she said, then waited until Bob turned around to look at her.
Take the other one as well, and let's hope the basement is shielded.
She could see him narrowing his eyes, then glancing down at the wooden box in her hands before he nodded and grabbed 2 of the things out of the truck.
not part of the regulation.
He chided, but gave her a wink. Yeah. According to their training, any person was only supposed to carry one of those boxes at one time. Taking more than that could increase the danger significantly. But Tia felt it deep in her bones. It was important to set up the boxes as quickly as possible, and then leave the basement immediately. This one she was carrying was far worse than the ones in the attic or upper floor. The thing inside of it was very, very bad news. Bob jumped down from the van, picked up the 2 boxes and closed the door with his foot. Time was of the essence now.
Let's hurry,
Tia told him, before turning around. They made their way back to the front door of the house and walked up the steps and into the anteroom. This part would stay free from cursed objects, Tia knew. The owner was setting it up so that pretty much every single other room would hold a spirit, which looked to her like a deliberate trap. It would be possible to throw people in here and then have them get drawn in by the ghost. Maybe she should look out for cameras for once. If there were, this whole place might hold a completely different meaning. The sound of her footfalls echoed around her as she walked into the big open room with the piano, then turned to the right and looked at the stairs leading up to the next floor. There was no way in hell she would ever ascend those again. But next to them, Tia could see a white door with a small paper sign stuck to it. Basement, it said. She grimaced and told Bob to keep up while she headed toward it. Her eyes wandered around the room a bit, and Tia thought she could see something dark in the upper corner. A camera.
Shit,
she mumbled, but kept her voice low enough to hardly make a sound. This house was to either become an experiment or some sick and twisted game for some rich asshole who wanted to see people getting devoured by spirits. Either way, it had nothing to do with her, she told herself. They were only here to fulfill an order, to set up what the owner had planned. Whatever happened after that was not something she should even care about. Tia reached the door, put out a hand and opened it. The air coming up from the basement had a musty smell, but seemed strangely normal compared to this oppressive atmosphere. Still, Tia hesitated for a second, and her colleague noticed it as well. A hand touched her on the shoulder, and she could feel him shivering.
I don't like it,
she heard him say, but simply nodded instead of answering. Any word she could speak would be pointless. Tia knew. Not only did they have a job to do, but they were paid rather well for this task, and the employer would lose their mind if they failed. And Tia knew exactly what would happen to them. She tried to put on a smile as she descended the stairs and felt the box in her grasp shaking softly. Yeah, this thing really was waking up. It was struggling against the charms, slowly breaking them down.
Soon,
she wanted to say, but kept her mouth shut. Provoking it right now would only lead to problems later. Carrying this thing around already was bad enough. It almost felt like she was balancing a bomb on her hands, Tia thought, and finally reached the bottom of the stairs. Bob was behind her, with his 2 boxes. If everything went well, they could be out of here in a few minutes, she told herself to calm her nerves. It didn't help much. She could feel herself shivering slightly as she looked around the floor. This basement was so different from what she had imagined. While the ground floor had this wide-open room layout, this place here was far darker. It seemed built with the express purpose of confusing whoever came down the stairs. She could see a corridor going to her left, a sharp corner up there, and a dark spot where the light from the bulbs didn't reach. Tia felt this revulsion building in her mind, coupled with what she had seen of the rest of the villa. The cameras, the hidden compartments. This place here felt like a real trap, meant to hurt people. What would it look like once the spirits started moving? It could turn into a labyrinth. Would in all probability. She shivered, but walked on and heard Bob behind her. He was breathing heavily, as if the boxes he was carrying were far heavier than before. Tia could feel it, this strange, ominous sensation that they were both in danger already. She didn't like it, and would have loved to turn around and run, but Tia knew that wasn't an option. Not with the way this job had been set up.
Let's hurry. I can feel the tremors running through the box,
she whispered, and heard a grunt coming from the man in her back. Tia passed the dark spot on the floor and felt a shiver as she turned to walk along the corridor that seemed to run along the whole side of the basement. At least she could see it already. The 2 doors to the rooms, and right at the back, the small hiding spot for the 3rd one.
Shit,
she mumbled, and turned her head for a second.
Do the side first. We should set the last box in the corridor together.
He nodded, and Tia felt another pang of unease as she saw how pale his face now looked. Her colleague was having trouble holding the boxes, she knew, but there was nothing they could do about it besides hurrying up. She fell into a jog and immediately felt the thing in her hands responding. Maybe it was her fear. Maybe the sudden movements. Whatever the reason was, the box started shaking now, and she could already hear the clasp scratching against the wood. She really, really needed to hurry up. Tia started running and left Bob behind. He wouldn't be able to keep up with her now, but that didn't matter. The quicker she set this thing up, the faster she could help him. She reached the door, kicked it open, and almost immediately froze. The room in front of her was big, filled with shelves and boxes that blocked large parts of it from her eyes. She hated it from the first moment she stepped inside. Where was the hidden compartment? Tia tried to remember. Maybe in the wall? She took a step forward and felt the box in her hands vibrating violently. Shit. This was cutting it far too close. She turned her head and looked through the empty shelves. There, in the back of the room, she could see something on the ground. A hole in the floor. Tia ran past the rows of racks and shelves, while the box in her grasp began to rumble. It was waking up fully already. Shit. That shouldn't have happened until they had left the house. She slid around the corner and headed for the open hatch in the back. Tia could feel it now clearly, this coldness spreading through her fingers. Jumping forward, she tried to stop thinking about it. Any shred of fear or doubt might make this thing notice her presence. She shushed herself in her mind as she came to a sliding stop in front of the open hatch and softly put the box on the floor next to the hole. One of her hands had to stay on top of it as the wooden thing still rumbled around. Tia closed her eyes and started chanting. The words she had learned flowed out of her and echoed back from the walls. Her hand felt cold. So cold. She didn't want to open her eyes, fearing that she would see her own arm frozen already. The chanting seemed to reverberate through the box. Tia could feel the rhythmic tremors mimicking her own voice. Sweat was breaking out all over her body. This part normally wasn't that bad, she thought. It was meant to calm them down, to keep them docile, at least for a while. But right now, it only felt like this thing in there was reaching out more and more, touching her body, mind, and soul. She could feel its presence lingering in the air around her. Two hands grabbed her from behind and held her by the shoulders. A cold breath right down her neck. Tia yelped and opened her eyes. The box was there in front of the hole. She gave it a shove and slammed shut the hidden hatch, sealing it inside.
Fuck that ritual,
she growled as she shot up. It was far too dangerous now. They would simply put both the other boxes into their hiding spots and leave. Tia turned around and ran through the gap between the shelves. This thing would wake up on its own. No need to open the clasp or do that dumb ritual to completion. She needed to find Bob, and then they could get out of here. Tia almost crashed into one of the shelves holding some cardboard boxes. She slid around the corner and found herself in front of the door. It was closed. That shouldn't be the case. Tia shook her head and started running again. She didn't care. Right now, she wanted to get out of here. Needed to. This thing in the room was waking up. Almost awake already. She needed to leave this place before it either possessed her or did something else. Tia ripped open the door, jumped out, and slammed it shut behind her. The bang echoed back from the walls as a sudden, cold chill gripped her heart. She looked along the corridor. First to her left, that would lead to the exit. The dark spot in the corner was pitch black. A shiver ran through Tia's body. Every instinct in her mind warned her not to go there, that she needed help She turned right and ran along the corridor to the other door, where her colleague would now be working. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see that the hatch in the wall at the back of the room had disappeared. It had been closed. Shit. Tia cursed her colleague in her mind. She would tear him a new one as soon as they had left here. Not letting it slow her down, she continued running, reached the door to the side room of the basement, and ripped it open. In front of her was a big wide hall full of shelves with cardboard boxes. She stopped in her tracks and looked inside. No sign of Bob. Why would there be? She was staring at the main room in the basement. Tia jumped back and looked down the corridor. To her left, the dark spots seemed to have grown. To her right, the other door where Bob would be. She started to run toward it. The small hatch had disappeared, she realized again, reached the door to the side room, and opened it. In front of her was a big, wide hall, full of shelves. She could feel her legs shaking as she looked around the room. A shadow seemed to grow in the back, where the hidden compartment was. The light above it flickered, and slowly, all the other bulbs hanging from the ceiling joined in. Tia jumped back and threw the door shut. The bang echoed around the walls. If she couldn't run to her right, she would need to head left. Easier said than done, Tia thought, as she looked along the corridor and into the darkness of the corner. This was bad. She was caught. Either this thing had possessed her, or it really had risen fully and was already changing the layout of the house. Whatever the case was, she needed to get out. And the easiest way for that was to leave this basement. Tia gave out a shout, hoping that Bob would hear her, either rescue her or follow her out. They needed to leave here. It didn't matter if the job had been completed or not. She started to run along the corridor, just as the first light bulb above her began swinging softly and flickered. It was coming, her instincts told her. This thing was on its way here. She ran and could see the corridor in front of her extending. It felt like she was caught in a bad dream, Tia thought, then closed her eyes but continued to sprint. Whatever was happening to her, standing still would mean death. In her mind, she screamed for help. The dark spot in the corner so far away continued to shift and move, with the lights above flickering. It looked like it was breathing while it grew. She could feel her chest tightening as she ran toward it. This was a bad idea. Every part of her screamed. But Tia didn't have any other choice. Whatever had been in that box was a malevolent force. Something that shouldn't have been simply stowed away in such a flimsy container. Or was this all planned? Had the owner chosen them as the first subjects for his sicko fantasy? Tia couldn't think about that right now. She could feel the coldness of the air around her, smelled the stench of rot and sulfur in the air, and knew that this thing was getting closer. She opened her eyes and saw the darkness of the corner already right in front of her. Her feet touched the ground, and she shot forward into what felt like an abyss. All the lights seemed to disappear around her in an instant, as did the smell and the sounds. She couldn't hear her own footsteps or her hectic breathing. It was completely dark here, Tia whirled around and glanced back the way she had come. There was nothing. Wherever she looked, all she could see was this never-ending night. A completely impenetrable wall of black all around her. She screamed and felt her mouth open, but no sound was coming out. Something was in here with her, she knew. Something bad, old, and malevolent. Tia whirled around and tried to run, but she felt neither the floor nor her own body moving. It had her, this thing. She should have never come here. Tia cried out as hot tears ran down her face. Silently, she screamed for help as the darkness around her shifted again. He was watching the screen intently. The pictures on it were giving him goosebumps. First test is a success, he mumbled and smiled, as through the camera he watched the body of the young woman shaking. In front of her stood a box, balancing on the edge of the hidden hole where it would soon come to rest. This thing had been worth every penny, he marveled. He didn't even have to do much himself. It had broken free of its constraints on its own. The woman was lifting up, seemingly being dragged from the floor and up into the air. Her whole body was tense, her eyes open, even though he knew she wouldn't be able to see anything. This was a perfect possession. He watched the door fly open, and the second one of the workers stumble into the room. Too late, the man whispered, and looked on as the guy fumbled around with his belt while running toward the floating figure of the woman. With a push of a button, he turned on the microphones throughout the house and heard a bellowing scream as the man rounded the last shelf before he could reach his colleague. He wouldn't even need to dispose of the body, the man in the comfy chair thought, and let himself sink back. Well, he would need to get some more experienced people in there to finish the job. There were still 8 boxes to set up before he could officially open this hell house. He chuckled, then watched the screen as a scream came through the speakers, followed by the unmistakable sound of a neck being broken like a twig.